The morning Ruth Quinn planted her boots in the red dust of Caldwell Street and spread her arms wide. She was not thinking about love. She was thinking about the 12 years of sweat and grief soaked into every plank of the building behind her. It was the autumn of 1882 in the small but stubborn town of Harlow, Kansas, a settlement that had grown up fast along a bend of the Cimarron River, the way wildflowers grow along a fence. Not because anyone planned it, but because life finds its way through whatever cracks it can. Harlow was the kind of place where the wind never quite stopped talking and the dust never quite settled, where cattlemen drove their longhorns through the main street twice a year and left their money at the saloon, the general store, and wherever else it could be pried loose from their calloused hands. It was not a pretty town, but it was a real one, built by real people who had carried their whole lives across the prairie in canvas-covered wagons and decided, one October afternoon, that they had gone far enough. Ruth Quinn had been one of those people. She had come to Harlow at the age of 22 as a new bride, riding beside her husband Daniel on the buckboard seat with her hair tucked under a sunbonnet, and her heart so full of plans it nearly burst. Daniel Quinn had been a carpenter and a dreamer, the kind of man who looked at an empty lot and saw a dining room, who looked at a rough sawn board and saw a chair that would hold a family together for 3 generations. He had built their home with his own hands, a 2-story clapboard structure on the corner of Caldwell and Harlow's Main Street, with a covered porch that caught the afternoon shade and a wide bay window that Ruth had always loved because it let her watch the whole world go by without leaving her kitchen. Daniel had died of typhoid fever in the spring of 1878, 4 years after they arrived. He had been 30 years old. Ruth had been 26, and she had buried him in the churchyard behind the Methodist chapel, and then she had come home and sat in that bay window for 3 days without eating, watching the empty street and trying to understand how the world could possibly still be moving when the center of it was gone. She had a daughter to raise. Eliza was 3 years old when Daniel died, small and solemn, and already possessed of her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. Ruth had looked at that little girl and understood that grief was a luxury she could afford only in small portions, that the rest of her time and energy belonged to keeping them both fed and housed and whole. She had taken in sewing at first, then laundry, and finally she had opened the front room of the house as a bakery, selling bread and pie and sweet rolls to the miners and cowboys and townspeople who came through Harlow with hunger in their bellies and a few coins in their pockets. The bakery had grown slowly, the way good things do, until Ruth Quinn's place was known across 2 counties for the best apple pie west of Wichita, and women came from neighboring settlements to learn how she got her crust so light. By the autumn of 1882, Ruth was 30 years old, lean and strong from years of kneading dough before sunrise, her chestnut hair threaded with the first early strands of silver, her hands rough but sure, her eyes the pale, clear gray of the sky over the Cimarron an hour before a storm. She was respected in Harlow. She was also in the way of widows who manage well alone, a little frightening to the men in town, who admired her from a comfortable distance and did not trouble her unless they wanted pie. Eliza was 7 now, a quick-minded child who helped in the bakery on Saturday mornings and spent the rest of her time reading every book that came through the town's small lending library and pestering the schoolteacher with questions that had no easy answers. Ruth loved her daughter with a ferocity that sometimes surprised her, a love so large it occasionally felt like fear. The fear that something might take Eliza the way typhoid had taken Daniel, swift and merciless and indifferent to prayers. It was that fear, that love, that bone-deep attachment to the place Daniel had built with his own hands, that put Ruth Quinn in the middle of Caldwell Street on that cool October morning with her arms stretched wide, and a crew of 6 men staring at her like she had lost her mind. She had not lost her mind. She had simply run out of other options. The trouble had begun 3 weeks earlier, when a man named Victor Crane arrived in Harlow on the westbound stage from Dodge City. Victor Crane was 51 years old, heavy-jowled and possessed of the kind of smooth, unhurried confidence that comes from having more money than most people will ever see in a lifetime. He wore a fine wool coat and carried a leather satchel stuffed with papers and contracts, and he had bought himself a room at the Harlow Hotel and proceeded to spend the next 2 weeks eating the hotel's food, drinking its whiskey, and buying up parcels of land along Caldwell Street at prices that seemed generous right up until the moment you understood what he intended to do with them. Victor Crane was building a railroad spur. Not the main line that had already bypassed Harlow by 20 miles, a wound the town had not entirely recovered from, but a spur line running from the main southern Kansas railroad track down to a stretch of land Crane had purchased east of town, where he intended to build a stockyard and freight depot large enough to handle the cattle trade for the entire region. It was, by any measure, a significant enterprise. It would bring money to Harlow, jobs to the men who needed them, and a reliable means of shipping cattle that would make the twice-yearly drives unnecessary. The town council had approved Crane's project at an extraordinary meeting, attended by every business owner in Harlow except Ruth Quinn, who had not been informed of the meeting because, as one council member later admitted with visible embarrassment, they had not thought to include her. The problem, as Ruth discovered when she received the legal notice tacked to her front door on a Thursday morning, was that Victor Crane's plans for Caldwell Street included the demolition of her building, her bakery, her home, the structure Daniel had built with his own 2 hands in the summer of 1874. Crane had purchased the 3 parcels on either side of her property months ago, through a lawyer in Dodge City who had dealt with a different landowner in each case, none of them realizing until it was too late that the sales were part of a coordinated acquisition. Crane needed Ruth's lot to complete the section of the street he intended to grade and widen to allow heavy wagons to pass from the depot to the main road. Her building sat directly in the path of his plans. The notice informed her that she had 30 days to vacate the premises, and that she would be compensated at a rate Crane had determined to be fair market value, a figure Ruth found so insultingly low that she had to sit down after reading it and breathe carefully through her nose until the urge to throw something passed. She had gone to see a lawyer. The only lawyer in Harlow was a pleasant older man named Horace Webb, who had reviewed the papers carefully and explained, with genuine regret, that Crane's legal position was strong. He had obtained a territorial variance from the county seat, and while Ruth owned her building outright, the lot beneath it had originally been granted under a homestead patent that contained a right-of-way clause for public improvements. Crane had exploited that clause. It was, Horace Webb said quietly, exactly the sort of thing that happened when powerful men with good lawyers turned their attention to small towns. Ruth had gone to the town council. She had stood in front of 5 men who could not quite meet her eyes and explained, clearly and calmly, that she would not leave, that her husband had built that building, that her daughter had been born in the upstairs room, that her business was the livelihood that kept them both fed and clothed and housed. The council listened. They expressed sympathy. They said their hands were tied. Crane's project would bring the town economic growth they could not afford to refuse. She would be compensated after all. She could start over somewhere else on the edge of town. Start over somewhere else. As if a life could be picked up and set down like a jar of flour. Ruth went home. She sat at her bay window and she thought about Daniel, about how he had measured every board twice before cutting it, how he had taken a full week on the porch alone because he wanted the posts to be perfectly plumb. She thought about Eliza asleep upstairs. She thought about every morning she had risen before dawn to light the oven, every customer who had come to her door hungry and gone away satisfied, every neighbor who had sat at her table through some difficult time and been given a cup of coffee and a slice of something warm and sweet, and told, without words, that they were not entirely alone in the world. Then she made her decision. On the morning Victor Crane's wrecking crew arrived 6 men with sledgehammers, a large timber frame wagon for hauling debris, and a written demolition order signed by the county commissioner. Ruth Quinn walked out her front door, stepped off the porch, and stood in the middle of Caldwell Street with her arms spread wide, her boots planted in the dust, and her gray eyes steady and unblinking. The foreman of the crew was a tall man with a red beard named Hicks. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had a job and needed the wages, and he looked at the woman standing in the road with her arms out and felt the particular discomfort of someone who has been placed in an impossible position by an employer who did not bother to anticipate complications. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I have a demolition order signed and witnessed." "I can see that," Ruth said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. "You are not demolishing this building today." "Ma'am, I have to. You have to stand there and wait," Ruth said. "Because if you swing a single hammer at this building, you will have to swing it through me first, and I do not believe you are willing to do that." Hicks was not willing to do that. He looked at his crew. His crew looked at him. They all looked at the woman standing in the road with her arms out. That was the precise moment that Ralph Slater rode into Harlow. He came in from the north, which meant he had been on the Cimarron Trail, which meant he had probably been riding since before the sun was up, because the Cimarron Trail from the junction was a good 4 hours on horseback, and it was only mid-morning. He was riding a bay mare with a white blaze down her nose, and he sat in the saddle the way men do, when riding is as natural to them as breathing loose-shouldered. Easy, his hat pulled low against the October wind. He was 34 years old, tall, with the kind of lean, weathered face that spends most of its time in sun and wind, dark eyes that moved quickly and catalogued a scene the way a careful man learns to do in country where being slow to read a situation can get you killed. Ralph Slater was not a violent man. He was, in fact, almost precisely the opposite. He had been a cattle drover for 12 years, working the long trails from Texas up through Kansas, and before that he had spent 2 years as a deputy marshal in a small Texas county, which was where he had learned that most trouble in the world comes from men with power deciding that the rules were meant for other people. He had quit the marshal's office over exactly that principle, a land dispute in which the county commissioner had used his authority to dispossess 3 homesteading families in favor of a cattle baron who contributed generously to local political campaigns. Ralph had filed his badge on the desk and walked out, and he had been working cattle ever since, which was harder on the body and easier on the conscience. He was in Harlow because he had been hired to deliver a small herd of horses to a ranch south of town, a job that had been completed the previous afternoon. He had intended to stay one night at the hotel, collect his pay, and continue west toward a new job in Colorado. He had no particular connection to Harlow. He had never been here before, but Ralph Slater was the sort of man who noticed things. And what he noticed, as his mare picked her way down Caldwell Street toward the hotel, was a woman standing in the road with her arms stretched wide, facing down 6 large men with sledgehammers, and holding her ground with the particular stillness of someone who has made up her mind and does not intend to unmake it. He pulled his mare to a stop. He sat there for a moment and watched. He saw the foreman talking. He saw the woman answer. He saw the crew shifting, uncertain, the way men shift when they want someone else to make the difficult decision. He saw the woman's arms, steady and wide, and he recognized in her posture something he had felt himself, the absolute determination of a person who has arrived at the outer limit of what they are prepared to endure and has decided to stand there and hold that line, whatever the cost. Ralph Slater swung down from his mare, tied her loosely to a post outside the hardware store, and walked over. "What is happening here?" he asked, directing the question at the foreman rather than the woman, because he wanted to understand the situation before he put his weight anywhere. Hicks explained. He was honest about it, to his credit. He had a demolition order for the widow's building. She was refusing to move. He did not know what to do next because his instructions had not covered this particular scenario. Ralph looked at the woman then. She was looking at him with those storm-gray eyes, and the look was evaluating, not desperate. She was not looking for rescue, he understood immediately. She was looking to see what kind of man he was. "Who issued this order?" Ralph asked. "Victor Crane," the foreman said. "And where is Victor Crane right now?" "Hotel, I expect." Ralph nodded slowly. He turned to the woman. "How long have you been standing here?" "About 20 minutes," Ruth said. "And I intend to stand here for considerably longer if necessary." Something shifted in Ralph's chest at the directness of her. He was not a man given to impulsive feeling, but there was something about the way she stood, not defiant in an angry, reckless way, but defiant in a deeply principled one. The way a person stands when they are not standing for themselves, but for something that matters beyond themselves, that moved him in a way he did not immediately have words for. "Is this your property?" he asked. "It has been my property for 8 years, Ruth said. "My husband built it. I have raised my daughter in it. I have run my business from it. And I will not leave it to be knocked down so that a man who arrived in this town 3 weeks ago can grade a road for his wagon traffic." Ralph looked at the demolition order that the foreman was still holding. He held out his hand, and the foreman, for some reason he could not afterward explain, handed it over. Ralph read it carefully. He was not a lawyer, but he had spent 2 years as a deputy marshal and had read enough legal documents to understand what he was looking at. The order was signed and dated. It referenced a territorial variance number and a county commissioner's seal. He handed it back to Hicks. "I am going to the hotel to speak with Victor Crane," Ralph said. "Do not swing a hammer until I get back." He was not sure why Hicks agreed to this. Perhaps it was the quality of his voice, which was the voice of a man used to being listened to in situations that required a clear head. Perhaps it was the relief of having someone else take responsibility for the next decision. Whatever the reason, the foreman nodded and the crew stood down, and Ralph Slater walked toward the hotel. He had not yet introduced himself to Ruth Quinn. He had not yet told her his name, or explained who he was, or why he thought he could walk into a situation he had happened across by accident and do anything useful in it. He had simply looked at her and made a decision the way he made most decisions, quickly, cleanly, and without a great deal of second-guessing. Ruth watched him go. She kept her arms spread for another full minute after he disappeared through the hotel's door, because she did not yet know if she trusted him, or if she trusted anyone in this town who was not herself. Inside the hotel, Ralph found Victor Crane at breakfast, a substantial breakfast, the kind of breakfast a man eats when he does not have to worry about the cost of eggs. Crane looked up with the mild irritation of someone interrupted during a pleasant task. "Whatever you are selling, I am not buying," Crane said. "I'm not selling anything," Ralph said. He pulled out the chair across from Crane and sat down uninvited, which he could see immediately annoyed Crane considerably. "My name is Ralph Slater. I'm a drover currently in town on business. I happened to ride past a scene on Caldwell Street this morning that I have some questions about." Crane set down his fork. "That scene, as you call it, is none of your business." "You are trying to demolish a widow's home," Ralph said. "I tend to make those kinds of things my business." Crane looked at him with the calculating attention of a man who is accustomed to reading opposition and finding its price. "She is being compensated," he said. "Fairly." "She does not think it is fair. Her feelings are not legally relevant." "Perhaps not," Ralph said, "but I looked at that demolition order and I have some doubts about the right-of-way clause in her homestead patent. I think a lawyer who was not paid by you might read it differently than the county commissioner did." Crane's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. "You are a lawyer now." "I was a deputy marshal," Ralph said. "Long enough to know the difference between a legitimate legal process and one that has been engineered." There was a silence. Outside on the street, faintly, the sound of wind and nothing else, the crew was waiting. "What do you want?" Crane asked. "I want you to pull your crew back for 30 days, Ralph said. "Give her time to contest the order properly with a lawyer of her choosing in front of the circuit court judge when he comes through. If the order holds, she will have to accept it, but she deserves that chance." Crane leaned back in his chair and studied Ralph for a long moment. And why should I do that? The order is legal. My timeline is fixed. Because if you do not, Ralph said, then what happens when your crew tries to move her, and it gets physical, is going to be reported in every newspaper from Dodge City to Wichita as a powerful businessman forcibly removing a widow from the home her late husband built. That is a story that tends to make investors nervous. It was a calculated risk. Ralph did not know if Crane had investors who might be nervous about that kind of press, but he was betting, based on the size and ambition of the project Crane was building, that he did. Crane was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his fork again, which was not agreement but was also not refusal. 1 week, Crane said. She has 1 week to get a lawyer in front of the county commissioner and make her case. If she fails, the order stands and I will not give her another day. Ralph held Crane's gaze. 30 days. The circuit judge comes through in 3 weeks. That is the appropriate venue. Another silence. Crane ate a bite of egg and appeared to think about it. 2 weeks, Crane said finally. That is my final offer. Ralph stood up. I will tell her. He walked back out onto the street. The crew was still standing around the wagon, leaning on their sledgehammers and looking thoroughly unenthusiastic about their morning. Ruth was still standing in the road, though she had lowered her arms. She had been holding them out for the better part of half an hour, and her shoulders ached in a way she would not have admitted for anything. Ralph stopped in front of her. In the full morning light, he was taller than she had first thought, and she could see clearly that his face was the face of a man who spent most of his time in open country, not handsome in a polished way, but solid, honest, with a directness in his dark eyes that she found, somewhat to her own surprise, reassuring. Crane has agreed to a 2-week postponement, Ralph said. You have 2 weeks to get a lawyer to contest the demolition order before the circuit judge. Ruth stared at him. You walked in there and got Victor Crane to agree to that. He had interests to protect too, Ralph said. I just pointed that out to him. Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at the crew, who were already climbing back onto the wagon, visibly relieved to be doing something other than standing in the road waiting for a widow to be moved. She looked at the building behind her, the porch, the bay window, the sign above the door she had painted herself in careful letters, Quinns Bakery. 2 weeks is not much time, she said. No, Ralph agreed. It is not. She looked at him then, really looked at him, with that evaluating attention he had noticed before. Who are you? You are not from Harlow. No, he said, I am passing through. I delivered a horse herd yesterday. I was leaving this morning. Were you? Yes. And instead you walked into the hotel and argued with Victor Crane on behalf of a woman you do not know. Ralph considered that for a moment. He was not entirely sure how to explain it to her when he was not entirely sure he could explain it to himself. You were standing there with your arms out, he said finally. A person does not do that unless the thing they are protecting matters enough to stand in front of sledgehammers for. That seemed worth paying attention to. Ruth was quiet. Then she said, My name is Ruth Quinn. Would you like a cup of coffee? I expect you have been riding since before sunrise, and I find that things are easier to think through with something warm inside you. Ralph almost said no. He had a habit, built over years of moving from place to place, of keeping his entanglements simple. Arrive, do the job, leave, don't complicate things. But the morning air was cold, and the coffee was a genuine offer from a woman who was not given to making insincere ones, and he found that he did not want to ride away from Harlow quite yet. Thank you, he said. I would. He tied his mare out front and followed Ruth Quinn into her bakery for the first time. The interior of the building was exactly what its exterior promised, solid, warm, well-ordered, and full of the smell of bread that had been baked earlier in the morning. The front room held a counter and 3 small tables where customers could sit, and everything about it was clean and practical, without any of the fussiness that sometimes made such places feel as though they were performing domesticity rather than living it. A small chalkboard behind the counter listed the day's items. A little girl with dark eyes was sitting at one of the tables doing sums on a slate, and she looked up when Ralph walked in with the direct, unself-conscious attention of a child who had not yet learned to pretend indifference. "Eliza," Ruth said, "this is Mr. Slater. He is going to sit with us for a little while." "How do you do?" Eliza said, with the slightly formal politeness of a child who has been well taught. "Very well, thank you," Ralph said, and sat down at the table the girl was not using. Ruth brought coffee, strong, black, the genuine article, and a plate with 2 thick slices of bread and butter that Ralph had not asked for but discovered immediately that he needed. She sat down across from him and wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked at the table for a moment, organizing her thoughts. "Horace Webb is the only lawyer in town," she said. "He was sympathetic but told me the order is likely to hold. I do not think one more conversation with him will change that." "The circuit court is a different matter," Ralph said. "Webb was operating within the county system, which is where Crane has his influence. A circuit judge is federal and has less reason to favor a local businessman." Ruth looked up at him. "You know about circuit courts?" "I was a deputy marshal for 2 years," he said. "Federal system." "Why did you leave?" It was a direct question, and Ralph respected directness. "A land dispute," he said. "A commissioner used his authority to take 3 families' homes for the benefit of a wealthy rancher. I filed my badge and walked out." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "And now you are a drover. Horses mostly, sometimes cattle. Do you like it?" "More than I liked watching injustice get dressed up as law," he said. She nodded slowly, as if this answered several questions at once. "The circuit judge," she said, "will he actually have the authority to set aside the county order?" "He can review whether the right-of-way clause was legally applied," Ralph said. "And if there are questions about the process, whether Crane coordinated the surrounding property purchases in a way that amounted to coercion, those are matters a federal judge can examine." Ruth absorbed this. Eliza had stopped pretending to do her sums and was listening openly, her dark eyes moving between the 2 adults with bright interest. "You would need a lawyer who knows federal procedure," Ruth said. "Yes. Horace Webb does not. Probably not. Is there anyone in Dodge City?" Ruth thought about it. "There is a man named Aldridge who I have heard mentioned. He took on a railroad case 2 years ago." "Then you need to get a letter to Aldridge today," Ralph said. "And you need to get it on the eastbound stage. It leaves at noon." Ruth looked at him steadily. "You are still here, Mr. Slater." "It appears so." Something shifted between them then. Not yet anything that could be named, but the beginning of something. The way the first degree of warmth is not yet heat, but is already the absence of cold. Ruth looked at this man she had known for approximately 45 minutes and understood that he was not staying out of obligation or pity. He was staying because he was the kind of man who, once he has put his weight on a particular side of a thing, does not easily shift it. She wrote the letter to Aldridge while Ralph finished his coffee. She wrote it standing at the counter with her back to the room, and the letter was precise and organized, and did not ask for sympathy. It asked for legal expertise, and stated the facts of the case with the kind of clarity that comes from having had several weeks to think about nothing else. She sealed it, addressed it to the Dodge City Law Office of J.P. Aldridge, and had it at the stage office by 11:30. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest, and in some ways the most full weeks of Ruth's life since the weeks immediately following Daniel's death. Strange because they were made of equal parts anxiety, and something she did not have a name for, full because Ralph Slater had not left. He had not said he was staying. He had simply continued to be present, in the quiet, purposeful way of a man who has found something worth being present for, and is not prepared to examine that too closely just yet. He negotiated with the proprietor of the livery stable for a sleeping space in the loft. He was not a man to take charity, and would not hear of staying anywhere that cost Ruth Quinn anything. And he spent his days being useful in the particular way that men with practical skills and no immediate employment can be useful. Fixing the loose hinge on the bakery's back door that Ruth had been meaning to attend to for 6 months, repairing the broken railing on the porch, chopping the winter's supply of firewood that was stacked behind the building in quantities that were adequate but not generous. He did not do any of this in a performative way, as if to impress her. He did it the way he did everything, quietly, competently, without announcement or expectation of recognition. Ruth noticed, because she noticed everything, and she thanked him simply and did not make more of it than it was, which was the quality in her that he appreciated most. She was not a woman who played at things. She was straight and clear as the Cimarron in January, and he found her company. When they sat together in the evenings after Eliza was in bed, talking over coffee at the bakery table about the case, about law, about Harlow, about the country they had both crossed to get here, to be the easiest company he had experienced in years. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, youngest of 4 brothers, leaving home at 18 to work cattle drives because the farm was not large enough for all of them, and he had always been easier in open country than in rooms. He told her about the marshal's office and the land dispute that had ended it. He did not tell her everything. There were things he held back, not because he was hiding them, but because he had spent so many years moving alone that the habit of not explaining himself was deeply ingrained, and he was still learning, in small, careful increments, that this particular woman was worth the effort of breaking it. Ruth told him about Daniel. She did not speak of him often, and when she did it was without self-pity, but also without the forced brightness that some widows use to signal that they are all right and moving on. She spoke of him as a real person who had been real and was gone, and the way she did it told Ralph more about the quality of her heart than anything else she said. "He would have liked you," she said one evening, which surprised both of them. She looked at her coffee cup. He appreciated men who did things for the right reason rather than for what they would get from it. "He sounds like a man worth missing," Ralph said. "He was," Ruth said simply. The response came back from Aldridge in Dodge City on the 7th day express mail, which cost more than Ruth liked to spend, but which Aldridge had apparently decided was warranted by the circumstances. He would take the case. His fee was significant but manageable if Ruth could access the savings she had kept carefully accumulated over 8 years of the bakery's profits. He would appear before the circuit judge when the court convened in Harlow in 12 days' time. He needed Ruth to compile documentation of the original homestead patent, the history of the property's ownership, and any records she had of Crane's acquisition of the surrounding lots. This last part was where Ralph proved most useful. He knew what to look for. Deed records were public, and the county clerk in the nearest county seat kept copies of all land transactions. He rode there and back in a single long day, returning after dark with copies of the deed transfers that showed, clearly when laid out in sequence, that Crane's lawyer had purchased the 3 surrounding lots on 3 different days from 3 different owners, all within a 6-week window, all at prices just high enough to seem reasonable, but none of the sellers informed that their properties were part of a coordinated acquisition designed to isolate and then legally compel the sale of a specific target parcel. "This is pattern evidence," Ralph said, spreading the documents on Ruth's bakery table by lamplight. "It shows deliberate engineering. It will not be enough by itself to invalidate the order, but it gives Aldridge something to work with. Crane deliberately obscured his intentions from each seller, which raises questions about whether the process that led to the county variance was fully transparent." Ruth studied the documents. Eliza, who had not been sent to bed yet because it was late and the day had been long and Ruth had not quite gotten around to it, was sitting at the far end of the table doing her best to look invisible. "You are not invisible," Ralph told the girl pleasantly. Eliza looked delighted. "How did you know?" "Because you have been breathing very carefully for the last 10 minutes, which is what people do when they are trying not to be noticed," Ralph said. Eliza giggled, a genuine, unself-conscious sound that filled the room. Ruth looked up from the documents and caught Ralph's eye, and they shared a smile over the girl's head that was brief and simple and felt, in its simplicity, like something important. Aldridge arrived 2 days before the circuit court convened, a sharp-featured man of 45 with quick eyes, and a way of moving through a room that suggested he was always mentally 3 steps ahead of the current conversation. He met with Ruth and Ralph at the bakery for 2 hours the evening before the hearing, reviewing the documents and asking precise questions. He did not seem particularly surprised that Ralph was there. He asked, at one point, how Mr. Slater was connected to the case. "He is helping me," Ruth said. Aldridge looked between them briefly and accepted this without comment. The circuit court convened in the Harlow Town Hall, a large room that served for everything from council meetings to dances, its benches rearranged into a rough approximation of a courtroom whenever the judge came through. Judge Emmett Harker was 60 years old, thin, with a white beard and the kind of patience that comes from having listened to human beings argue about land and money for 30 years, and finding that the arguments were always essentially the same. Half of Harlow had turned out to watch. The room was crowded and warm and smelled of boot leather and anxiety. Ruth sat at the plaintiff's table in her best-dressed navy wool, high collar, the one she had worn to church every Sunday for 3 years, and kept her hands folded on the table and her expression composed. Ralph sat in the front row of the gallery. He was not a party to the case and could not sit with her, but he was as close as he could get, and Ruth was aware of his presence at her back the way you are aware of a fire in a cold room, not by looking at it, but by the quality of warmth it puts into the air. Crane sat at the opposing table with his Dodge City lawyer, a man named Forsyth who had sharp eyes and a practiced smoothness that Ruth recognized as the legal equivalent of a card sharp's hands. Aldridge was not smooth. He was precise. He laid out the case in clear, organized language: the homestead patent and its right-of-way clause, the question of whether the clause had been properly invoked, and then the pattern evidence, the coordinated purchases, the deliberate obscuring of intent, the question of whether the county commissioner had been fully and honestly informed of the process by which Crane had engineered his acquisition. Forsyth objected. He objected smoothly and often. Judge Harker sustained some objections and overruled others, and did both with the equanimity of a man who has seen better lawyers than either of these argue-worse cases. Crane was called to testify. He was composed and articulate. He acknowledged the coordinated purchases but characterized them as ordinary business practice. He maintained that the county variance had been properly obtained. He was, Ralph noted from the gallery, a man who was very good at telling the truth in ways that obscured it. Aldridge's cross-examination was surgical. He asked Crane whether each of the 3 landowners from whom he had purchased the surrounding lots had been informed, at the time of sale, that their properties were being acquired as part of a coordinated plan to obtain Mrs. Quinn's lot through a legal right-of-way action. Crane said the sellers had been informed of his general development plans. Aldridge asked him whether that was a yes or a no. Crane said it was a yes. Aldridge then produced a sworn affidavit, obtained the previous day, from one of the 3 original sellers, a farmer named Beaumont who had sold his lot 6 months ago and had signed a statement that he had not been told anything about the coordinated nature of the acquisition or its ultimate purpose. Forsyth objected. Judge Harker allowed it. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Judge Harker took a 30-minute recess and returned with his decision. The right-of-way clause in Mrs. Quinn's homestead patent, he ruled, was valid. Crane had legitimate authority to invoke it. However, the judge found that the process by which the county variance had been obtained was irregular, in that material information about the coordinated nature of the acquisition had not been fully disclosed to the commissioner at the time of application. He was therefore setting aside the current demolition order pending a full review by the county commissioner with complete documentation, a process that, by the county's own procedural rules, would take a minimum of 90 days. He also noted, with the quiet authority of a federal judge who has spent 30 years watching powerful men, use legal machinery to move around people who cannot afford to fight back, that the pattern of coordinated acquisition in this case sat at the edge of what the law could call fully fair, and that anyone who wished to see the law used as a tool of genuine justice rather than a weapon of advantage would do well to consider whether the outcome they were pursuing was truly proportionate to the harm it was causing. It was not an invalidation of Crane's project. It was a delay and a warning, but it was enough. Ruth sat very still for a moment after the gavel came down. Then she let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 3 weeks. The room came alive around her, people talking, moving, the particular buzz of a community that has watched something happen and is now processing what it means. Aldridge shook her hand and told her the 90-day review was their opportunity to continue building the legal case. Crane, across the room, spoke briefly and quietly with Forsyth, and then looked at Ruth with an expression that was not quite concession, but was not quite opposition either, the expression of a man recalibrating. Ruth turned and found Ralph standing just behind her. He had come through the gallery gate the moment the gavel came down, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not yet seen on his face. Relief, she realized. Genuine, personal relief, as though the outcome had mattered to him not as a matter of principle but as a matter of her specifically. "It is not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you have 90 days, and 90 days is a long time for a lot of things to change." She looked at him for a moment in the noise and movement of the room around them, and there was something in the air between them that was no longer quite the professional partnership it had been. "Mr. Slater," she said quietly, "I want to say something to you." "All right. You came through this town on a horse 2 weeks ago on your way somewhere else," she said, "and you have spent 2 weeks helping a stranger fight a legal battle that is none of your business and for which you have received nothing. I do not know how to properly thank you for that." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I do need to," she said. "Because otherwise you will ride away and I will spend a long time wishing I had said it clearly while I had the chance." She paused. "Thank you, Ralph. You are a good man. That is not as common as it ought to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "Ruth," he said, and the use of her first name for the first time was quiet and deliberate and felt in the room like something shifting. "I rode into this town expecting to be gone in a morning. I find that I am not particularly eager to leave." "No," she said. "No," he said, and then, because he was a man who said what he meant, "I would like to stay for a while if you will allow it, not because of the legal case, because of you." The noise of the room continued around them. Somewhere in the crowd Eliza appeared at Ruth's elbow, tugging at her sleeve, wanting to know what had happened, wanting to understand what the judge's decision meant, full of questions as always. Ruth put her hand on her daughter's shoulder and looked at Ralph. "You may stay," she said. "I would like that very much." The 90 days were full. Aldridge continued to work the legal case from Dodge City, filing requests for documentation from the county commissioner's office and corresponding with Ruth by letter about the progress of the review. Crane, faced with a genuine legal delay and the growing awareness that the story of a widow holding her arms out in front of a wrecking crew had made its way around the county and was generating a kind of public attention he had not wanted, began slowly, privately, through Forsyth, to explore whether a different route for his wagon road might be feasible. Ruth knew none of this in real time. She lived the 90 days the way she lived all her days, rising before dawn to light the oven, working through the morning, managing the bakery, caring for Eliza, attending to the 100 small practical tasks of a life built on her own effort. But the days were different now, in a way she noticed but did not analyze too closely at first. Ralph was there, not in a demanding or intrusive way. He was the opposite of a man who makes himself felt through his needs. He was present in the way that something load-bearing is present. You notice it most when you think about what would happen if it were not there. He helped with the morning deliveries twice a week when the bakery sent orders to the hotel and the general store. He chopped wood and mended things and spent long evenings at the table talking with Ruth while Eliza slept. Conversations that ranged across everything from the legal case to the history of the territory to the books Ruth was reading to the nature of a life lived honestly versus a life lived well. As though these two things might or might not be the same thing, and the question was worth examining. He was good with Eliza, who had taken to him with the specific, discerning attention of a child, who has learned to watch adults carefully and trust very few of them. She asked him questions about cattle drives and horses and the geography of the territory, and he answered all of them seriously, without the patronizing simplification that children recognize immediately and resent. He taught her to play checkers and lost to her 3 times in a row before he started paying proper attention and stopped losing, which Eliza found both annoying and satisfying. "She is remarkable," he told Ruth one evening after Eliza had gone to bed. "She is," Ruth said. "She is her father's mind and my stubbornness in equal measure. That is a formidable combination." "She is going to do extraordinary things," Ruth said, with the calm certainty of a mother who has been watching a child for 7 years and knows what she is seeing. "I just have to keep this building standing long enough for her to launch herself from it." Ralph looked at her. The lamplight was warm in the kitchen, and outside the wind was doing what it always did on the Cimarron plain, always moving, restless and directionless. "You are building this place for her," he said, "not just keeping it." "Yes," Ruth said simply, "it is what Daniel built for us, and now it is what I am building for her. That is how it works, I think. You receive what someone gave you, and then you give it forward to someone else, and the thing that passes between the giving and the receiving is the part that matters." Ralph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father built a barn for us when I was 9, best barn in the county. He said a man shows what he believes by what he builds, not by what he says." "Yes," Ruth said softly, "exactly that." They looked at each other across the table. The lamp between them made the shadows warm and the room small, and the distance between them, which had been comfortable and appropriate for weeks, suddenly felt like something that required a decision. "Ruth," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I should say it plainly. I wish you would." He looked at his hands on the table for a moment, then he looked up at her. "I did not expect this," he said. "I was not looking for it. I was on my way to Colorado, and I had no intention of staying anywhere long enough for it to matter. But I find that you matter to me, more than I know how to say without it sounding less than it is." Ruth was quiet. She looked at the table and then at him, and the lamplight caught the gray of her eyes and turned them warm and complicated. "Daniel has been gone 4 years," she said. I was not expecting this either. I did not think I had room for it. I was not sure I wanted room for it." She paused. "I find that I may have been wrong about that." "May have been," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Probably," she admitted. "Almost certainly." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. It was a simple thing, unhurried, without any quality of performance. It was just his hand over her hand, warm and certain. Ruth looked at it for a moment and then turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while without speaking. Outside, the wind moved along the street, and the town of Harlow was quiet and dark, and the lamp burned steadily between them. The change in Victor Crane's position came in the 7th week of the review period, and it came not dramatically but practically, the way most real changes come. Forsyth sent a letter to Aldridge proposing a renegotiation. Crane had engaged an engineer who had surveyed the route alternatives for his wagon road, and there was a viable alternative path that ran 2 lots south of Ruth's property, using a parcel that was already unoccupied and could be acquired without the complications of an inhabited building. The alternative added a modest additional cost and slightly less convenient geometry, but it was workable. Crane was willing to pursue it, provided that the legal review was concluded with no findings against him and no precedent set that could complicate his other property dealings in the territory. Aldridge brought this to Ruth by letter, and then, when she did not immediately respond, by appearing in person in Harlow on a Thursday afternoon to sit at her bakery table and explain the situation. "He wants you to drop the review," Ruth said. "He wants the review concluded without adverse findings," Aldridge said carefully, "which means I would get my building and he would walk away clean." "Correct." Ruth thought about it. She looked at Ralph, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his coffee and who was carefully not telling her what to think. "What about the other people he has done this to?" Ruth said. "The 3 sellers who did not know what they were part of, Beaumont, the others." "They received fair market value for their land," Aldridge said. "There was no legal harm done to them." "Not legal harm," Ruth said, "but they were deceived. They made decisions without the information they needed to make them properly." "That is not a small thing." "No," Aldridge agreed, "it is not." Ralph spoke then without looking up from his coffee. "The question is whether you fight for the principle or accept the outcome." "What would you do?" she asked him. He looked up. "I would ask what Crane will do differently in the next town if he walks away from this one without any consequence." Ruth looked at the table. Then she looked at Aldridge. "I want 2 things," she said. "My building stays standing and is fully and permanently removed from any right-of-way consideration. And Crane's Dodge City lawyer sends a written letter to each of the 3 sellers, on record, explaining that their properties were acquired as part of a coordinated plan, and that they could have sought different terms had they been fully informed." Aldridge blinked. "That second item is unusual." "Yes," Ruth said, "it is. But those 3 people deserve to know what happened to them, even if the legal moment has passed. It is a small thing for Crane to do, and it costs him nothing except a small amount of honesty which he owes them." Aldridge took this back to Forsyth. Forsyth took it to Crane. There was a day of silence and then agreement. Crane's conditions were met, and so were Ruth's. The demolition order was formally withdrawn. The right-of-way claim on Ruth's property was permanently released. And 3 letters were drafted, signed, and sent to 3 farmers and 1 retired stagecoach driver who had sold their properties 6 months ago without knowing the full picture, and who received those letters with a range of reactions from anger to wry resignation, but who had, at minimum, been told the truth. Ruth stood on her porch when Aldridge left Harlow and looked at Caldwell Street and breathed in the cold October air, almost exactly a year now since this had all begun, and felt the particular relief of a thing resolved. Ralph came out onto the porch and stood beside her. He had his jacket on against the cold, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which was, Ruth thought, one of the things she loved about him. He always knew when coffee was needed. She had admitted to herself by this point that she loved him. It had not happened in a single moment, but in accumulation, the way most true things happen, in the small, steady weight of days spent together, in conversations that left her feeling more herself rather than less, in the quality of stillness he brought to a room that was not emptiness but presence, in the way Eliza had one evening 3 weeks ago called him Ralph instead of Mr. Slater without even seeming to notice she had done it, and he had responded as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She took the coffee he offered. "It is done," she said. "Yes," he said. "You should probably go to Colorado," she said. "You were on your way there a year ago." "Colorado can wait," he said. "It has been waiting this long." She looked at him. "Ralph, I want to be clear with you about something." "All right." "I am not a woman who does things in halves," she said. "I am not built for a slow fade, for something that starts and then drifts. If you are here, I need you to be here. And if you are going, I need you to go while I still have enough distance from it to manage." He looked at her directly, the way he always did, no evasion, no softening. "I am not going anywhere," he said, "unless you send me, and I do not intend to give you a reason to." Ruth was quiet for a moment. The street was quiet too, the cold afternoon light falling clean and gold across the dust of Caldwell Street. "My daughter loves you," she said, "which is not a small thing." She did not love many people quickly. "I love her too," he said simply. "She is extraordinary. You said so yourself, and you were right." Ruth looked at her coffee cup and then at him. "I was very much in love with my husband," she said, "and I lost him. and the loss of him was terrible in a way I do not think entirely goes away. But what I feel for you it is its own thing. It is not what I felt for Daniel, and it should not be, because you are your own person and this is its own time. But it is real. It is as real as anything I have felt." "Yes," he said. "I know. I feel it too." She reached over and took his hand, the way she had at the table weeks ago, simple and certain. The cold air moved along the porch, and the sign above the door said Quinns Bakery, and the building stood solid and whole behind them, unchanged, as Daniel had built it. "Stay," Ruth said. "Please stay." "I will," Ralph said, and he meant it in the simple, absolute way of a man who has made a decision and will not revisit it because it is right. The winter that followed was the warmest Ruth had known in years, which had nothing to do with the weather. Kansas winters along the Cimarron were not gentle. They brought ice and wind and blizzards that could pin you indoors for 3 days at a time. But the interior of the bakery was warm, and the company was good, and there was a particular quality to those months that Ruth would remember for the rest of her life as the time when things settled into their right shape. Ralph found work with a local rancher named Calloway, who ran a modest spread east of town and needed an experienced hand for the winter. It was not demanding work, mostly maintenance, mending fence, caring for the stock in the cold months, but it was honest, and it kept Ralph from feeling like he was living on Ruth's goodwill, which was something he would not have been comfortable with. He rode out to Calloway's in the mornings and was back by late afternoon most days, and he ate dinner at Ruth's table 4 nights out of 7, which was the arrangement that felt natural rather than imposed. Eliza had taken to setting his place at the table without being asked. Ruth noticed this the first time it happened and said nothing, because some things are better received in silence. Christmas came and went. Ruth baked enough to provision most of Harlow and sold out of everything by Christmas Eve, and Ralph spent Christmas Day at the bakery, helping Eliza assemble the small wooden dollhouse he had built for her in the Calloway barn over the preceding 3 weeks, working on it in the evenings with the quiet concentration he brought to anything that required care. Eliza's reaction to it, a burst of pure, unguarded joy that she immediately tried to moderate because she was 7 and considered herself somewhat grown-up, was one of the finest things Ralph had experienced in years. He asked Ruth to marry him in January. It was not particularly romantic in the conventional sense. They were in the kitchen. It was after dinner, it was cold outside, and Eliza had gone up to bed. Ralph had been turning something over in his mind for 3 weeks, and he had finally arrived at the point where continuing to not say it felt dishonest. He was not a man who proposed by speeches or elaborate gesture, and Ruth was not a woman who needed those things. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be your husband and Eliza's father, and I want to build a life here with you in this town, in this building that Daniel built, and I want to do it properly and permanently. That is what I want, if it is what you want." Ruth looked at him across the table. She had known it was coming, the way you know weather is coming before it arrives. You feel it in the quality of the air. She had been turning it over in her own mind. She had thought about Daniel, about whether marrying again felt like replacement or betrayal, and she had concluded after long and honest consideration that it did not, that a person can love 2 people at different times and in different ways, and that neither love erases the other, that Daniel was not in the past because she had stopped loving him but because he was gone, and that Ralph was in the present because he was here, alive, real, and worthy. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." They were married in March at the Methodist Church, a small ceremony attended by the people of Harlow who had known Ruth for 8 years, and who turned out with genuine warmth for a woman they respected. Eliza stood at Ruth's side and was given a specific and important role. She held the small bouquet of early spring wildflowers Ruth had gathered from the bank of the Cimarron that morning, and she performed this role with great seriousness and occasional barely suppressed smiling. Horace Webb, the lawyer, was there. The schoolteacher was there. Several of the ranchers and their wives from the surrounding area who had been Ruth's customers for years were there. Even the foreman Hicks, who had stood on Caldwell Street 8 months ago with a demolition order and a sledgehammer, and found himself outmaneuvered by a woman with her arms wide, came by the church afterward to shake both their hands and say, with a sincerity that surprised everyone including himself, that he was glad the building was still standing. Victor Crane was not there. Victor Crane had completed his depot and spur line by the alternative route, and had departed Harlow in February, having extracted a reasonable profit from his enterprise, and left behind him something between a legacy and a cautionary tale, depending on who in town you asked. The 3 letters had been sent and received. Beaumont, the farmer who had signed the affidavit, had come into the bakery once in December to buy a pie, and had told Ruth that the letter had not given him back anything he had lost, but that it had given him the truth, and that was something. Daniel would have been glad, Ruth told Ralph the evening of their wedding day, sitting on the porch in the cold March night because they had both needed a moment of air after the warmth and noise of the day. Not replaced by you, glad for you, there is a difference. I know, Ralph said. He had his arm around her shoulders against the cold, and she was leaned into his side, and the street was quiet and dark and full of stars. He chose this place because he said the sky was bigger here than anywhere else he had been, Ruth said. He was right. Ralph looked up at the Kansas sky, which was immense and clear and scattered with light in all directions as far as the eye could reach. He was right, Ralph agreed. They sat there for a while, the 2 of them under that sky, and it was one of those moments that asks nothing of you except to be present in it. Spring came to Harlow with its usual combination of mud and light, and the beginning of warmth that made everything seem possible. Ralph expanded his work with Callaway. The rancher had offered him a permanent position as foreman, which carried better wages and better hours, and suited Ralph's particular combination of skills and temperament well. Ralph accepted. He rode out in the mornings and came home in the evenings, and the shape of the days acquired the solid, satisfying quality of a life that has found its right form. Ruth's bakery continued to grow. She took on a girl from town, 17-year-old Clara Moody, to help with the morning rush, which freed Ruth to develop the wholesale side of the business, supplying bread to the hotel and to the new freight depot's cookhouse, which turned out to be a reliable and substantial contract. By midsummer, she was turning a profit that surprised even her own careful accounting. Eliza turned 8 in July, celebrated with the largest cake the Quinn household had ever produced and a particular gift from Ralph, a small, well-made journal with a leather cover, and tucked inside it a letter he had written to her, 2 pages long, telling her what he saw when he looked at her, and what he believed she was capable of, written in the plain and honest language he used for everything. Eliza read it privately and came downstairs afterward with red eyes that she was clearly determined not to explain, and then asked Ralph to play checkers, which he did and lost 3 times, and did not mind even a little. By late summer, Ruth was aware that something had changed in herself, a particular quality of tiredness in the mornings, a change in appetite, a sensation she recognized because she had experienced it before, 8 years ago in the upstairs room of this very building. She told Ralph on a quiet evening in August, sitting at the kitchen table where they always seemed to have the conversations that mattered. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "As certain as one can be at this stage," Ruth said. He looked at her. His face did something complicated that resolved itself slowly into a kind of overwhelmed gratitude that he clearly did not quite know how to contain. "Ruth," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it with both of his, and neither of them said anything else for a while, which was exactly right. Eliza received the news with 8-year-old gravity, processing it for approximately 30 seconds before announcing that she intended to be an exceptional older sister, which Ruth had no doubt was true. The pregnancy was healthy. Ruth's body, accustomed to hard work and regular hours, managed the months without the drama she had half expected. She was tired more than usual through October and November, but the bakery ran smoothly with Clara's help, and Ralph was attentive without being hovering, which was the balance that suited Ruth best. He was home every evening. He learned over those months where she needed help and where she needed to be left to manage herself, and he calibrated accordingly, which was one of the many reasons she loved him. In December, as Harlow settled into its second winter since the crisis on Caldwell Street, Ruth found herself sitting at the bay window on a quiet afternoon, the window that Daniel had built, the one she had sat at for 3 days without eating after he died, the one she had looked out from for 8 years watching the world go by, and she thought about the particular shape of a life. You do not know, when you are standing in the middle of a street with your arms spread wide, that the wrecking crew will stop. You do not know that the man who comes to speak to the foreman will have dark eyes and a steady manner, and a history that has made him precisely the kind of man who cannot ride past something unjust without stopping. You do not know that the worst moment, the moment when everything you have built is about to be destroyed, will turn out to be the door through which something necessary and irreplaceable walks into your life. You cannot know any of that. You just have to stand there with your arms out. Ruth pressed her hand to the curve of her belly, feeling the movement that had become familiar and beloved over these months, and she thought about Daniel and the building he had made, about Ralph and the days they had made together, about Eliza upstairs doing her reading, about the town outside the window that had watched all of this unfold from a respectful distance, and then gathered to celebrate when things came right. The baby was born in the first week of March, a boy, sturdy and loud, with Ruth's gray eyes and Ralph's dark hair, born in the same upstairs room where Eliza had been born, delivered by the same doctor who had delivered most of Harlow's children for the past decade. Ralph was downstairs during the labor with Eliza, who was managing her anxiety by playing checkers against herself with fierce concentration. When the doctor called down that it was over and all was well, Ralph took the stairs 2 at a time, and then stopped in the doorway of the room and looked at Ruth in the bed with the small, wrapped, already complaining bundle in her arms. "A boy," Ruth said. Ralph crossed to her side and she put the baby in his arms. He held him with the careful competence of a man who has handled enough living things to know how to hold something fragile and precious without crushing it. The baby blinked up at him with unfocused newborn eyes, and Ralph looked down at him with an expression Ruth had never seen on his face before, wholly unguarded, every wall down, all the careful steadiness of him temporarily replaced by something so open it was almost painful to look at. "Hello," Ralph said quietly to the baby. "Just that, hello." "I thought Daniel," Ruth said, "for a middle name if you are willing." Ralph looked up at her. "Daniel," he said. "Yes, that is right." They named him James Daniel Slater, James for Ralph's father, Daniel for the man who had built the room they were in and whose presence, 4 years gone, was still somehow part of everything that mattered in this place. Eliza came up when the doctor allowed it, stood at the foot of the bed, and looked at her brother with the solemn, assessing attention of a person taking on a significant responsibility. Then she said, "He is very small," with a tone that suggested she found this both alarming and interesting. "He will not stay that way," Ruth said. "I suppose not," Eliza agreed, accepting this with practical wisdom. She looked at Ralph. "Are we winning at checkers when he is old enough to play?" "Absolutely not," Ralph said. Eliza grinned. The spring of 1884 came in warm and early along the Cimarron, and Harlow woke up from winter with the particular energy of a place that is growing faster than it expected to. The railroad spur was operational and the depot was busy, and the cattle trade had shifted from the old driving patterns to a more reliable shipping schedule that made the town considerably more prosperous than it had been. New buildings were going up along the main street. A second general store had opened. There was talk of a proper school building to replace the rented room where Harlow's children had been educated for years. Ruth expanded the bakery's capacity by converting the back portion of the ground floor, which had been storage, into a proper work kitchen with a second oven and a larger prep area. She hired Clara full-time and a second girl part-time, and the business that had begun as a widow's means of survival had become, by any honest accounting, a genuine commercial enterprise. She did not take this for granted. She remembered what it felt like to stand in the road with her arms out, and that memory kept the success clear and real rather than something to become accustomed to. Ralph's work at Callaway's had grown too. The rancher had expanded his herd, and Ralph's role as foreman gave him oversight of a crew of 7 men and a daily range of responsibility that suited him well. He was, Callaway told anyone who asked, the best foreman he had employed in 30 years of ranching, steady in a crisis, fair with the men, and possessed of the specific quality of good judgment that cannot be taught and is worth more than any number of skills. Eliza, 8 going on 9, had become a fixture of the bakery's morning operations, appearing at the counter on Saturday mornings to help serve customers with a competence that Ruth found both admirable and slightly astonishing. She had also, under Ralph's quiet encouragement, begun keeping a journal in the leather book he had given her for her birthday, filling it with observations about the town and its people and the questions that occurred to her in the course of daily life, written in a hand already more legible than most adults, in Harlow. James was 4 months old and had the disposition of a person who finds the world fundamentally interesting. He was watchful and curious, easily startled into laughter, and showed every sign of having inherited the best qualities of both his parents without yet being burdened by any of the more complicated ones. Ralph held him in the evenings when he came home from Callaway's, walking him slowly back and forth in the kitchen, while Ruth finished the last of the day's baking, and the sight of this man, who had ridden into Harlow a year and a half ago on a bay mare with a white blaze, on his way somewhere else with his son in his arms in the kitchen of the building that Daniel Quinn had built with his own 2 hands, was one of those sights that makes you feel that the world, despite its extensive evidence to the contrary, is sometimes exactly as it should be. There was one evening in April when Ruth stood at the bay window watching the street and Ralph came to stand beside her, James asleep on his shoulder, Eliza's voice audible upstairs where she was reading aloud to herself the way she did when a book was very good. The light outside was the long horizontal gold of late afternoon on the prairie, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look both more real and more beautiful than ordinary. The sign above the door threw a shadow across the porch boards. "I keep thinking about that morning," Ruth said. "Which morning?" "When I walked out and stood in the road," she said. "I keep thinking about how I had no idea what I was doing, really. I had no plan beyond just stopping, making them stop." "It worked," Ralph said. "You made it work," she said. "You started it," he said. "I just rode by at the right time." Ruth looked at him. "Do you believe that it was just timing?" He considered this honestly, the way he considered most things. "I think some things are more than timing," he said. "I think that when something matters enough to make a person stand in the road with their arms out, it tends to draw the right kind of attention." She put her hand against his arm, the arm not supporting James. "This mattered," she said. "All of it. It mattered more than I knew how to understand at the time." "I know," he said. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "I am glad you came in for coffee. I am glad you stayed." He looked at her. Outside, the golden light lay across Caldwell Street and the building stood solid and permanent behind them, roof and walls and porch and bay window, exactly as it had been built, as it would be for the generation coming behind them. "So am I," he said. "There is nowhere I would rather be. There is nothing I would change." Ruth leaned her head against his shoulder beside the sleeping James. The evening settled around them. Inside the bakery the air was warm and smelled of bread and everything that meant home, and outside the prairie went on forever in all directions, wide and clear and still full of country that had not yet been crossed, and that was all right. They had found their place in it. They were not moving on. Eliza came down the stairs at some point and appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at the 2 of them standing at the window with the baby between them, and she did not say anything, which was unusual for Eliza. She just looked, and whatever she saw seemed to satisfy something in her that had been paying careful attention for a long time. Then she went to the counter and cut herself a slice of the bread that was cooling there, because she was 8 years old and perpetually hungry, and that was also exactly right. The months continued to turn. James grew from the watchful, curious infant into a steady, bright-eyed toddler who followed Ralph around the bakery on weekend mornings, with the focused determination of someone who has identified his primary role model and intends to study him closely. Ruth watched this and felt something move through her that was equal parts joy and an awareness of time, the way you feel when you understand that the present moment is going to be one of the ones you remember, and so you pay it the respect of full attention. Calloway retired the following summer and sold his ranch. He offered Ralph right of first refusal on the purchase, which Ralph could not afford outright but could, with Ruth's bakery savings and a note from the local bank, manage in partnership. They discussed it carefully over several evenings at the kitchen table, the risk, the potential, the practical reality of running a ranch alongside a bakery in a town that was still growing. Ruth said yes. She said yes because she trusted Ralph's judgment about land and animals and work, and because the ranch would be theirs in a way that nothing they were currently doing was entirely theirs, and because the additional land would give James something to grow into if he chose it, and because she was, at heart, still the woman who had stood in the road with her arms out. She did not flinch from large decisions when the reason for them was sound. They purchased Calloway's ranch in the autumn of 1885, 3 years after that October morning on Caldwell Street. Ralph ran it with the same quiet, competent commitment he brought to everything, keeping 2 of the original hands on and hiring 2 more, managing the herd through the seasons with the skill of a man who has spent his whole life learning the language of land and animals. The bakery and the ranch between them made for a full life, the kind that leaves you tired at the end of the day with the specific satisfaction of work that means something. Eliza, 11 by then and already beginning to think about what came after the Harlow schoolroom, had grown into a young person of extraordinary ability. She wrote better than anyone in her class, thought more precisely, and had a way of seeing straight to the center of a complicated question that occasionally alarmed her teachers and never ceased to delight Ralph, who had a long-standing theory that the most interesting minds were the ones that could not stop asking why. "She is going to leave Harlow," Ruth told Ralph one evening. "Yes," he said, "she is going to leave and do remarkable things and come back changed, and we will be glad for all of it." Ruth nodded. "I know. It is just hard to think about. You want her to stay small." "I want her to stay within reach," Ruth corrected him. "There is a difference." He put his arm around her. They were on the porch, the autumn of 1885, 4 years now since a wrecking crew had pulled up on Caldwell Street and found something in their way. The street was different now, wider, busier, several new buildings in the gaps where lots had once been empty. But Ruth's building was still there, the corner anchor of it, the sign above the door repainted but unchanged. Quinn's Bakery. And beside the front door, a smaller sign Ruth had added the previous spring, Slater Quinn Bakery and Provisions. She had added his name because it was right. He had objected mildly because it was still her building in every meaningful sense. She had told him that it was their life and that she would put his name on the door of their life or she would know the reason why. He had stopped objecting. "Daniel," she said suddenly. Ralph looked at her. "What about him?" "I think about him sometimes, and it is different now," she said. "Not less, but settled, like he is part of the foundation. He is in the walls of this place. He built them, and everything we are building is built on what he made." She paused. "I hope he knows." Ralph was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the people we have loved and lost are present in the lives we build after them if we build honestly. He is here." Ruth looked at the street. She thought about standing in it, arms wide, boots in the dust. She thought about the bay mare with the white blaze coming around the corner. She thought about coffee and legal documents and lamplight and the first time she had let herself say clearly to herself that she loved this man. "Ralph," she said. "Yes, I am glad you stopped." "You have said that before. I will say it many more times," she told him. "Because it is exactly as true every time I say it as it was the first time, and some things deserve to be said more than once." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head. Outside, the sun was going down behind the Cimarron plain, and the sky was doing what Kansas skies do at the end of the day, turning colors that do not have names in any language, colors that make you feel simultaneously very small and very fortunate to be present to see them. James was inside asleep because he was 2 and found evenings mostly unnecessary. Eliza was at the table reading by lamplight, visible through the bay window. It was an ordinary evening. It was a perfect evening. It was the kind of evening that neither of them would have been able to find their way to without passing through exactly the things they had passed through to get here: the loss, the grief, the legal fight, the mourning in the road, the stranger on a horse who could have ridden past but did not. Ralph Slater had not planned to stay in Harlow. Ruth Quinn had not planned to fall in love again. James Daniel Slater had not planned anything at all yet, being 2, but would have his whole life to make plans in this place, in this family, in the building that his mother's first husband had built with his own 2 hands, and that his father had helped his mother keep standing. The wrecking crew had not come back. Victor Crane had built his depot and his wagon rode along the alternative route and had moved on to the next town and the next project, as men like him always do. The 3 letters had been sent. Beaumont had gotten his truth. The law had been made, briefly, to serve the people it was meant to serve, rather than the people who could afford to make it serve them. And while that was not always the way of it, it had been the way of it this once, in this town, because a woman had stood in the road and refused to move. In the spring of 1887, Ruth gave birth to their second child, another boy, red-faced and loud, who arrived in the same upstairs room where both his older siblings had been born, delivered on an April morning while Ralph sat downstairs with James, now 3 and deeply offended by all the noise and inconvenience. They named the new baby Will after no one in particular, just because the name suited him. Eliza, 12 and fully committed to her role as experienced older sibling, examined him with the authority of a person who has already done this once and knows what to expect. "He looks exactly like James did," she said. "They generally do at first," Ruth said. "Will he stop looking like James eventually?" "He will look like himself," Ruth said. "Give him time." Eliza considered this. "I think he will be stubborn," she said. "He has got that look." Ruth laughed, a genuine, full laugh that filled the room, and Ralph, hearing it from downstairs, smiled in the way he smiled when Ruth laughed, which was different from all his other smiles, deeper and more private. James, presented with his new brother, studied him for a long moment and then looked up at Ralph. "Is he staying?" he asked. "Yes," Ralph said, "he is staying." James processed this. "All right," he said, with the philosophical resignation of a 3-year-old who is learning that the world contains surprises that require acceptance. Then he went back to what he had been doing. The years settled into their shape. The bakery and the ranch, Eliza and her relentless curiosity, James and his steady, watchful nature, Will and his stubbornness, which Eliza had correctly identified. Ruth and Ralph, and the accumulated weight of ordinary days which, laid one on top of another, became something that was not ordinary at all. Harlow grew. The railroad spur brought prosperity, and the prosperity brought people, and the people brought the particular energy of a place that is becoming something. A proper schoolhouse was built, a second church, a doctor's office that was not just the doctor's front room. The main street was graded and widened, not on Caldwell, not at Ruth's corner, but along a different route that the town had planned without anyone needing to stand in anyone's way. Ruth and Ralph sat on the porch one evening in the summer of 1890, which was 8 years after the morning she had spread her arms wide in the road, and watched Eliza, 16 now, already corresponding with a girls' academy in Topeka about enrollment, the following year walked down Caldwell Street with two friends, laughing at something one of them had said. James, 6, was in the bakery helping Clara, who had been with Ruth for 8 years now, and was as much a fixture as the oven. Will, 3, was asleep. She is going to go to Topeka, Ruth said. Yes, and then somewhere after that. Yes, and I am proud of her and I will miss her every day. Yes, Ralph said. Both of those things are equally true. Ruth leaned against him. He put his arm around her the way he always did, the way she had stopped noticing because it had become part of the natural order of things, like the bay window and the porch and the smell of bread in the mornings. She thought about the woman she had been in 1882, 30 years old, alone, holding the whole weight of her life in her own hands, standing in the road because there was nothing else to do. She was 38 now. She had a husband who was present and honest and good. She had 3 children who were variously remarkable, steady and stubborn. She had a bakery that was thriving and a ranch that was productive and a place in this community that was built not on what anyone had given her, but on what she had made and kept and fought for. She had the building, the one Daniel had built, the one she had stood in front of with her arms wide. It was repainted and had a new roof section on the east end, but the bones were the same bones, the frame and the porch and the bay window all exactly as they had been set in 1874 by the hands of a man who knew how to build something worth keeping. I love you, she said to Ralph, simply and directly, the way she said it. I love you, he said. Eliza had disappeared around the corner of the street, still laughing. The evening was soft and warm. The Cimarron Plain was gold in the late light, stretching away in all directions, immense and permanent and indifferent to the small human dramas played out on its surface, and yet somehow not unkind about it, as if the size of it was not dismissal but accommodation, room for all of it. Room for grief and stubbornness and legal hearings and strangers on horses and coffee at bakery tables and children growing into themselves. Room for the whole complicated length of a life that has been built honestly and held onto hard. Inside the bakery, through the bay window, Clara was laughing at something James had said, and the lamp was lit, and the building stood as it had always stood, solid, whole, real. Ruth Quinn had stood in the road with her arms out, and the world had rearranged itself around that gesture. It had given her this, all of this, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.